bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, this is Dean Baker. I'm here with the podcast, Mostly Economics. Today, I'm very happy to say I have my old friend, Jared Bernstein, with us. Jared most recently was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Biden. He previously had served as his chief economist back when he was vice president. In between, he was at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. And before that, both Jared and I were back at the Economic Policy Institute. He's written many books, most importantly, probably many volumes, including the first ones, The State of Working of America. I don't know how many, he could tell us how many he wrote. And then also, I'm happy to say we co-authored 2 books on benefits of full employment. Welcome to Mostly Economics, Jared.
Well, thanks for inviting me on.
I get obviously we're old friends. We've talked about all this stuff, but I have to say, I get the biggest kick out of it. We wrote 2 books on the benefits of full employment. And basically, you get into the Biden administration and you get a chance to put it into practice. So you come in there, it's the middle of the pandemic, and we all recognize the economy needs a boost. I say we know this. It seems to have been a collective changing of history, but the economy was in the dumps then. We actually lost jobs in December, the month before President Biden came into office. So the idea of it's bouncing back, that's not true. So you recognize the economy needs a stimulus. You come in there and $1.9 trillion, a lot of money, no doubt about that. But, I was saying this at the time, and obviously you were speaking publicly. This is a big deal. So the Obama administration arguably made the mistake of they went too low, took us forever to get back to something resembling full employment, 218, 219. You guys went big. And let me just ask, so 1.9, at the time, did you think it was too big? In retrospect, do you think it was too big? Was it the right call?
So that's 1.9 trillion, just to be
yes. Trillion, billion, whatever.
That's historically quite sizable. If you take it as a share of GDP, you'll still get, numbers that are north of 10% for the relief package. And if you include all the relief packages we did, maybe 15, 20% of GDP. And that's, a lot more than has historically occurred. But of course, the pandemic-induced shock was a deep recession. As you said, in December of 2020 and January of 2021, unemployment was still highly elevated. You had, go back and read, I know you know this, but go back and read what the Federal Reserve was saying at the time, nervousness about the extent to which the pandemic was continuing to drive really challenging economic results. So that economic shock of the pandemic was still upon the land. And in fact, other forms of COVID were coming, including Omicron. So we weren't out of the woods, and we knew we needed a hefty stimulus. To answer your question, I think we would have been okay with something that was a bit smaller than that. But I think that, particularly state and local assistance, at the time it looked to us like state budgets might be, more constrained than I think they turned out to be. So, look, hindsight, you can do a lot of great things, but, probably could have been smaller. I think one of the most important insights there is that as best as anyone can simulate, and there are a lot of good ways to make this case, we still would have had a lot of inflation no matter what. If you look at Europe, you see inflation trajectories that were much like ours, and of course they had very different fiscal policy. And if you try to model the impact of the stimulus spending, you could have had inflation that peaked at 7 or 8% instead of 9%, and the cumulative inflation, which led to price level unhappiness, would have still prevailed.
Yeah, it's been striking to me, obviously everyone could look in retrospect, hindsight, and say, oh, you guys blew it. And, frankly, I I agree with you in the sense that I didn't expect to get 1.9, to be honest. I thought you'd walk away with 1.6 or something, and that would have been great. 1.9, okay, maybe it was too much. But if we go back to what people were saying at the time, and here I'm thinking first and foremost of Larry Summers. I'm not putting any words in his mouth. I mean, he was jumping up and down, yelling, "This is the stupidest macro policy in 50 years. You're going to have stagflation." He was saying you're going to need massive unemployment to get inflation back down to an acceptable level. And again, I'm not putting words in his mouth. He was using very strong language. He thought this was horrible. At least that's what he was saying. And, the fact of the matter was that inflation did come back down look, we're in a different regime now, but if we look back to December, would we have liked it to be a little bit lower, around 2.5, 2.6, whatever? Yeah, sure. It would have been better too. But, what's the big difference? No one go back 20, 25 years. No one would have been upset about 2.5% inflation. And it certainly wasn't what Larry Summers was talking about. So that looks pretty good in the scheme of things. And, to my view, the serious counterfactual, suppose you'd gone substantially less, we would have had, say 1 to 2 percentage points less inflation.
Right.
With 1 to 2 percentage points less wage growth. Again, how that's distributed, another question. But it's not as though we all have 1 or 2 percentage points more money in our pocket. No one serious would say that. Mm-hmm. So if you just go, okay, so we did this and it was bigger than might have been optimal, and we got 1 or 2 percentage points more inflation than would have otherwise been the case. And here it is, end of 224, and inflation pretty much back to where we want it to be. Again, we could quibble where exactly we want it to be, but it's hard to be too upset about the inflation we had.
Yeah, let me just cut to the chase on this, which is, I think the American Rescue Plan very much lived up to its name. It was a really effective package. You could always tweak this and that, and you're right, we could have shaved some off, and we still would have had, I think, a similar cumulative increase in inflation. The price level would be pretty close to where it is, meaning what things cost, which was, by the way, what really got us into trouble in terms of vibes, how people felt about the economy. As you consistently pointed out in those years, we were posting strong economic numbers, particularly on the macro economy, and inflation, as you just said, was decelerating at a good clip without generating much higher unemployment. So we had a very, the predictions of a recession were proved to be wrong. But it's always important to look at, the full spate of benefits from the rescue plan. So when we got there, the vaccination rate among adults was about 0. And there is absolutely no way we could have had an economic recovery without that vaccination rate. So part of that was to, of course, part of the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, was to scale that up. There would have been a ton more evictions. Child poverty would have been a lot higher. There would have been a lot more business failures. We could have been looking at a kind of a scarring effect because families and businesses would have had great trouble getting to the other side. So if you want to factor those couple of points of extra inflation against, the benefits, people will come up with what they're going to come up with. You have to judge those trade-offs on your own. But there was no scenario wherein A, we weren't going to do any kind of a stimulus. People who were imagining 0 should have no credibility. Of course, we had to do something. B, where there wasn't, fairly extensive inflation. And C, where there wasn't unhappiness with the rising price level. And that did hit us hard in our messaging.
Yeah, let me mention 2 points that I think, and you guys, I don't think you guys always did the best defense, I'll say that, as you know. But 2 points that I think, can be overlooked. When you pass this package, it's February of 2021, the expectation was that the pandemic would come under control as you got people vaccinated. And again, it was a high priority, appropriately, to get the vaccinations out as quickly as possible. And you did a great job of that. I got mine in March. I sent you a note. I feel great. I got my vaccine. I can go out and start kissing people. I didn't, but my wife. But other than that. But anyhow, that was a huge deal. But what you didn't anticipate was we had 2 big subsequent waves of the virus. So that summer we had the Delta wave, and then in the fall, in I guess December and January, we had the Omicron wave. And this was a huge deal because one of the big things, which we all know about, the supply chain story. Well, what was that? Well, people weren't going to restaurants, they weren't going to movies, they weren't traveling. So instead, they're buying things. and the ships all got backed up because they're buying things. And as long as people didn't feel comfortable going out and going to restaurants, spending their money on services, in other words, they'd buy things. And that was something you couldn't really have anticipated back in February of 2021. So that was a really big hit that led to a lot more inflation than otherwise would have been the case. And of course, the other problem, who anticipated that Putin would invade Ukraine? And I guess
Right.
Trump has it the other way around. But, whatever. We have war there, and that caused huge disruptions, which again...
What you're getting at is something that I've referenced a lot when people ask me to explain what happened in a technical sense on the inflation, and it was really the collision of strong demand and constrained supply. I think anyone who tries to explain the inflation without either of those is missing something, and I think anyone who leaves either one out is missing something. So, there's been a debate in the economics profession of whether supply constraints really played a role, and that's just kind of silly to me because I was there, and I can tell you, going to work. I mean, I think maybe we were learning things that weren't that well known to the rest of the public, but there was a good example is at one point there was a microchip fabrication plant in Malaysia. It closed for 2 weeks. I think this was in 21 because of COVID, and North American production of vehicles shut down. I mean, Canada, U.S., Mexico shut down for, I think, 2 weeks as this factory shut down. Now, that, by the way, is an example of a highly non-resilient supply chain. That's another problem that we tried to deal with. But there's no doubt in my mind that it was the collision of strong demand and constrained supply. Now, I think there's a fair question is, did we contribute to strong demand? And of course, the answer is yes, because any stimulus that doesn't do that is failed by definition. And, then there's a question of how much you turn the dials. Let me say something about Larry, by the way, Larry Summers, just to kind of, you mentioned him earlier. There are a few people who helped me a lot when I was at the CEA. One of them I'm looking at right now, and Dean, I just want to thank you publicly for how helpful you were. Larry was also extremely helpful, and he's a good friend of mine, and obviously we had disagreements about things, but I did want to just get that down because he's someone I've learned a lot from over the years.
Well, I'll just say, again, Larry's a good economist. He's made a lot of good observations. This one, thankfully, he was wrong on. And I'll also say, I'm sure you caught this somewhere, it was in the fall, he made some comment to the effect that the American Rescue Plan was the most successful economic policy in, decades, something to that effect. I'm sure you caught that. So I took that as an acknowledgement that you guys got it right and he got it wrong. So, so I give him credit on that. A lot of people won't acknowledge that when they make a mistake. But let me flip over to the positive side. We could recognize nothing's going to be perfect. There were mistakes, but the positive side, I think, is hugely, hugely underappreciated. This is our full employment story. I mean, you got to 4% unemployment by the end of the year. I mean, that is just, incredible. I mean, that's a great success story. And then we stayed at 4% unemployment through 222. In fact, under 4, to be accurate, under 4. We got down to 3.4 at one point, through 222, 223, and into 224. And then it edges up. I mean, I rather wouldn't have seen it get over 4%, but, people would ask me, I can't be that upset about 4.3%. That was our peak, 4.3% unemployment. I think it was in July of last year. But that's an incredible success story.
No question. And, something you said earlier is striking to me about having a chance to be in government at a high level post and implement ideas you've been working on. I remember when I went to work for Vice President Biden in 2009, that was another great great recession. I mean, great, not like we liked it, but that was called the Great Recession. And you and I were also doing a lot of work back then on that one. But I remember having been in the Economic Policy Institute talking with colleagues around the water cooler about what we should do in what at that point was called the American Rescue and Recovery Act, the ARA. And we were saying, maybe schools could use some help and things like that. And then like a couple of days later, I was in the administration and we were putting together the recovery plan, and people were asking, what should we do? And I would give a similar answer that I would at the water cooler, but this time they were writing it down and, putting in legislation. And so the difference between, think tankery, nothing against that, it's where we all cut our teeth, but, actually being able to implement these things was remarkable. Of course, the Federal Reserve plays a key role in what the unemployment rate is. And, to their credit, after lots of nudging by outside economists like you, me, and many others, we were a bit of an army. I think there is a recognition that the lowest unemployment rate consistent with stable inflation was lower than they used to think it is. And so we've actually done better on full employment since, say, 2000 or the latter 90s when you and I were writing about full employment. We've done better on that. But between fiscal and Joe Biden, who really believes that worker bargaining clout is at the center of good economics, it was. We're proud of that record.
Yeah, with Jerome Powell, and we all had different criticisms, different times of the Fed. But I was very happy. This is back in the first Trump administration. He let the unemployment rate get down. I think we got as low as 3.6, maybe even 3.5. This was at a time when a lot of people are jumping up and down, yelling. If you get under, many of them even saying 5, and certainly under 4. That you're going to have a big problem with inflation. And Powell, to his great credit, and this is why I was haranguing, you guys got to reappoint this guy, because he let the unemployment rate get well below 4%. And, that was the great thing. We saw huge benefits from it. And of course, we saw even more, in the recovery from COVID. And again, this is hugely underappreciated. I assume you saw, our friends at the Economic Policy Institute just released data on, well, you tell us about it. You saw
Well,
it.
so this is if any of our listeners read the books that Dean and I wrote on this, every one of them features a graph that looks a lot like the one that the EPI just published. If you break wage earners down into deciles, so the bottom 10%, the second 10%, all the way up to the top 10%, and you ask yourself, which group does full employment disproportionately help? Which group does it help the most? It helps the lowest folks the most, and then the middle folks, and it doesn't do all that much for the folks at the top. And the reason is because bargaining power that full employment provides for working people is most important to the earnings of more economically vulnerable folks. So the EPI figure that they just published showed a real cascading of the growth in wages from, I don't remember the exact numbers, maybe you do, 7-8% at the bottom, to 2 or 3 at the top.
Got to correct you, Jared. It was 15% for the bottom decile.
So that must be cumulative over a bunch of years.
Yeah, over 5 years. Yeah.
Okay.
So 219 to 224, 5 years, we saw more than 15%, I think 15.3 if we want to be exact, wage growth for the bottom decile. And to put this in context, much of the prior 4 decades, you go back 1980, 90, 2000, much of that period, they were actually falling behind inflation. So to see it jump by 15.3%. Now I'm cognizant, neither of us are stupid. Someone was getting $15 an hour, this is inflation adjusted, getting $15 an hour in 2019, and then come 224, they're getting 17. We're not going to say they're doing great, but that's big progress. That's a big difference in their lifestyle, their living standard. That's another $4,000 a year. So, I'd love to see them getting 25. That's where they should be if wages had kept pace with productivity for the last 50 years. But that's not going to happen overnight. So this was huge progress. And, again, it's just enormously underappreciated. I know you were in the White House, you were engaged on Twitter, but I got all these people telling me, oh, they're working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, they can't pay the rent, they can't. Plenty of people are experiencing real hardship, but by almost every measure we have, particularly those at the bottom, were doing considerably better, 223, 224, than they had done back in 2019.
Yeah, so let me talk to you about that a little bit. I think it's worth going a little deeper into what you just laid out. because of course I agree with you, and you and I have, as we've said, have long been beating precisely this drum. And, now we have numerous business cycles wherein we've been able to show this disproportionate boosting of wages at the bottom through full employment. So no, I just don't think empirically there's much of an argument to have there. The problem or the challenge is where you took this in terms of affordability. So I don't think that people really, they're struggling to pay their rent. They're struggling to pay for childcare. They're struggling to pay for healthcare, for education. They're struggling to pay for all of that and save, much less take the family out for dinner once in a while. And, they get a real bump in their paycheck that's maybe even a little bit hard to see, 15%, over 5 years, 2 or 3% a year, that's good. But that might be a little bit, hard for people to suss out relative to their struggles, so that when we tell them, hey, look at this EPI graph, or full employment disproportionately helped you, their reference point is how much they're struggling. And, they're not wrong, as you and I would agree.
Yeah. No doubt about it. And again, I recognize, I said, look, we got an economy with 160 million people in the workforce, and, the bottom 20% have a really, really hard time. No two ways about it. And, I never minimize that. I'm just saying, by most measures, they're doing better today than they did in 2019. But again, no one, we're not trying to say, and of course, you were trying to do everything you can, try and improve situations, bring healthcare costs down, bring childcare costs down. You recognize that. And, you tried to get the child tax credit. These are all great policies. You met political opposition, weren't able to do it. But, again, it just was it better? And again, it's underappreciated that because we're able to get the unemployment rate that low, there were widespread benefits, again, particularly at the bottom. And also, we had the lowest Black unemployment rate ever, tied for the lowest Hispanic. We had a big increase in people with disabilities working. I mean, across the board, the people who are most disadvantaged in society benefited from that very low unemployment rate. And this, to my view, and I think yours, a really big deal.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let me shift a little bit. You guys tried, and I'm going to pick a bone with you here a little bit. Your industrial policy measures, the semiconductors, the clean energy, and the bone I'm going to pick is simply and I'm not really accusing you, but I know there's people who say, think of industrial policy like an on-off switch. And the argument I've made on this is that we actually always do industrial policy. And the example I always point to is the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, we spend $50 billion a year. We did. I don't know what we're spending now. But, we did spend $50 billion a year on biomedical research, mostly through NIH, but other agencies as well. We give patent monopolies that are worth hundreds of billions a year. If that's not industrial policy, what is? I mean,
I completely agree with that.
I realize
I think the thing about industrial policy is that there's sort of smart industrial policy, and then there's the rest. But there's not zero. I don't think you can find zero industrial policy anywhere.
Yeah, no, I just, and again, it's not particularly the bone I'm picking with you. It's, actually both sides of this, because on the one hand, you have people saying, oh, no, we got to leave it to the market. And, you go, no, we're not leaving it all to the market now. I mean, I have respect for the market. You have respect for the market. Very valuable institution. But the government is always playing a role in shaping the market.
Tax code, look at how the tax code favors finance. That's a sector. So that's an industrial policy. And by the way, that industrial policy, that's based on who has the best connected lobbyist. So I tell you right now, that is bad industrial policy.
Yeah, we're getting into the little weeds here, but I can't resist this. I probably told you this before. The carried interest tax deduction. When I first found out about it, someone told me, and I was a leftist, I thought, you got this wrong. It can't be right. Carried interest tax deduction, basically for private equity guys, hedge fund guys, pay much lower tax rate. So I said, that makes no sense. So I looked it up, and they were right. And then I contacted a friend of mine who's a prominent conservative economist. I said, why do you have this? I emailed and sent back. He goes, well, these are really powerful people. So I said, well, I know that, but I mean, what's the economic rationale? I said, oh, there isn't one. So, I think that's the tax structure for finance.
Yeah, there's there's a lot in the tax code that lacks economic rationale.
But, getting to, your promotion of, advanced semiconductors and, again, clean energy, I mean, I'll just let you talk about it. But I mean, to me, that looks like it's tremendously successful. Now, the Trump administration seems to have declared war on it. But,
Yeah.
up till, January 2025, it looked pretty damn good.
Yeah, so this is a very timely topic, and we wrote about it in an op-ed that's out, I believe, today in the Wall Street Journal, at least in the print version, because I looked at it during when I was having my coffee this morning. Um, so the the idea that I think we started from was very much what you and I just talked about. We're not starting from zero on industrial policy. We're trying to be thoughtful about where the government stimulates investment and where the government subsidizes investment. And that meant thinking about market failures, that is, parts of the market that would be underinvested in, having to do with the kinds of horizons that private investors operate under. And that takes you right to clean energy. I mentioned the chip issue earlier, where one factory closes down and it wreaks havoc across the continent. So that's another area where supply chain resiliency. Basically, you want to think about economic security, national security, strategic interests. And in those areas, we thought that clean energy, electric vehicles, batteries, we thought chips, but we viewed those, and of course infrastructure, basic infrastructure. We thought all of those were either public goods or areas where markets would underprovide. And so we managed, and again, I tip my hat endlessly, and I will never stop doing so, to Biden and the team that was able to legislate in a hostile environment. And that's made a real difference in the pace of investment, as you, I think, contributed to our op-ed, something like doubling the inflation-adjusted spending on domestic factory construction. So we're pretty aggressively standing up domestic production in all of those areas I just took you through. So that's one way to do that. Now, the current administration believes that the way to, quote, reindustrialize, the way to bring manufacturing jobs here, is to raise tariffs through the roof on everything and everybody, and hope that that will reduce the trade deficit and thereby reindustrialize. And that's just magical thinking without empirical backing. As we argue in our op-ed today, there's no evidence that tariffs, even sweeping tariffs, will reduce the trade deficit, and there are reasons for that: retaliation, stronger dollar. There's also the fact that something like 45% of what we import are inputs into domestic production already, so it just makes that much more expensive. Strengthening of the dollar is a problem in that regard. So I don't think their actions will affect the trade deficit that much. But even if they do, you have the example of Germany, which has been running large, really, economically large, 6% was the last one I saw, trade surpluses as a share of GDP. And they too have had decelerating factory employment as a share of total employment. We go through that in the piece a little bit. We cite some numbers. They have a higher level, but the decline in that share has been pretty similar, even as they've had persistent surpluses. So I think a much better way to pursue domestic production is the kind of thing we were going after than what they're doing.
Yeah, I think the success, and again, I think it's another success story that has been underappreciated. You were talking about the factory number, and this is right. This isn't, sometimes we get, I'm sure you have the same thing. People argue, where do you get that number? Blah blah blah. Well, this is right out of the National Income Product Accounts, Bureau of Economic Analysis. I haven't heard someone infiltrating them and making up numbers.
Not yet.
And not yet. Yes, that may change, but factory construction in 224 was double what it was in 219. And that's just really extraordinary. I mean, if you look back over the prior, I don't know how far back you want to go, you don't see big changes, and mostly it's downward, so getting it to double, if you want to compare it to the first Trump administration where he had tariffs, there's barely any change. It's down some years, up a little. It's not, there's no change to speak of 219 versus 216 when President Obama was still in office. So he didn't do it. And you guys did. You got factory construction doubled, and this was very much, the infrastructure bill, the Semiconductor Act, and the CHIPS Act, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. And again, it's a great story. I mean, we'll have to see how how things fare in the Trump administration. But that was a huge success story, I think, by any measure.
I mean, one of the things that I really worry about is, and this actually takes us to where is it? I have it right here. So I've been I read this book, Abundance. That's like the it book right now. And this is a book that argues, we really need to kind of take down some of the regulatory barriers to how we build things, including housing, as well as how we invest in research and R&D and innovation. Leaves out your patent work, so that's a real omission there, and leaves out your immigration work as well. By the way, in terms of the supply of doctors, for example. Yeah. So, there's some omissions, but the idea is one that I very much, very much align with. And, if you take the approach that we're trying to take, you're adding to the nation's supply stock. And in fact, I quoted this. I have a Substack, and this morning I was actually touting our piece, and I quoted a line from here, which you can find on my Substack, where is something about, all the stuff we're talking, this is the Klein and Thompson saying the stuff that Biden did, that really kind of went the right way in terms of building things in America again. So like after this long book of explaining all the reasons we couldn't, they sort of patted us on the back, and I thought that was good to hear. What tariffs do is they raise prices for consumers, right? So that's really not going to help. And I think it's going to hurt that you already see investors very much spooked by what's going on. And the businesses themselves, in no small part, because as I said a minute ago, many of the inputs that they use to build come from abroad. They import them to make them more expensive. That's why you have them going to the White House, banging on the door saying, can we please have an exemption? And these are the very groups that these tariffs are supposedly, supposed to help. So I think it's pretty wrong-headed.
Yeah, it's also, I can add this, and obviously that, one of the big problems, in particular the way Trump has put these tariffs in place, is that no one knows what they're going to be, how long they're going to be there, what the purpose is. So we hear from people in this administration, don't worry, this is a negotiating tactic. Okay, so I'm thinking, I'm GM. I'm thinking of expanding my production capacity. I'm going to get into, he doesn't like EVs, but then he does because Elon Musk makes them. So I don't know where we're on those. But anyhow, I expand my production capacity. But I don't know how much my inputs are going to cost me because we have this big tariff. But the tariff isn't going to be there because it's a negotiating tactic. But I don't really know. Yeah. And that's a huge, huge problem. And I think it's impossible to overestimate that, again, because you're just trying to put yourself in the shoes of one of these people planning a long-term investment, because you're going to build this factory. You want it to be there 10, 20 years. And you're trying to figure out what are my input costs going to be? What's my competition? Absolutely. And if you got a guy in their White House, well, it depends what I feel like that day.
Yeah, no, this isn't for anyone listening. This isn't just us hypothesizing. If you read the Wall Street Journal today, but there are many other articles, cover story about executives saying exactly what you just said. Literally, I was thinking about expanding, and now I'm not going to until there's some certainty. Now, people have been asking me, so, what if they did reverse what they're doing? Would that help? And, I think the answer is probably yes. I mean, I think if they declared victory on tariffs tomorrow and said, well, now we're just going to work on tax cuts, trust me, the markets and the businesses would like that, but they just keep doubling and tripling down on the tariffs.
Well, we'll just have to see. Hopefully they'll read our column and they'll realize that they made a mistake. Yeah, we've reconsidered. Yeah, we could dream. Okay. Yeah, let me just go on a little more, because I always give you guys grief for not boasting enough. One of the statistics that, we did a little work on, you had a huge surge in business formation, new business formation, record levels. And it was disproportionately women, disproportionately Black women, Hispanic women. And really, what I think most of us would like to see. And, I got a kick out of it because, Trump was going around calling Kamala Harris a communist. And going, well, whoever thought communism would be so good for business, but that was a great success story. And, I just, maybe you guys said it and no one picked it up. I don't know. But I
We
think
did.
very
We
few
talked a
people
lot
know.
about it. It was a talking point that I memorized, and I was just thinking back to some of the numbers, and they really were, exceptional in the tens of millions. Yeah. By the way, I remember Obama saying to me once, after being accused of being a socialist, and the market was doing very well, the stock market. He's like, "Boy, I must be a really bad socialist." And you get obviously, and. The, I think the boasting is, I don't know what the right word is, touting our record was a lot more complicated than it sounds. And I think you and this may be a source of disagreement, I don't know. People felt gaslit when we went out there and we talked about good things. Now, I could easily hold up the jobs report, the GDP report, the productivity report. There's no more important variable than that. And the small business creation, any one of those are facts. But people felt really bad about the economy because the cost level was what it was, even with their higher earnings. You and I talked about that a minute ago. And so they felt gaslit. I mean, I really believe that they felt that way. So we had to be careful. Now, it was in many ways, your voice on the outside was more helpful than ours on the inside because you weren't working for the administration. So you're just, you're a numbers guy, and you're citing these things. That was, great. That was very, very good to see. And people, believe me, people saw it and recognized it. It was harder for us.
No, I understand that. I understand that. I understand, well, of course, it was Harris who's running the campaign, but, she did have the problem saying, she'd be overlooking people suffering. And again, it's a story, it's an unfortunate story. We have a lot of people suffering. There's no two ways about it. And this isn't just a vibe thing. So again, looking at our distribution, we take the bottom 20%, they are suffering. There's no two ways about it. The bottom 10%, they can't be sure they're going to have a roof over their head. So, it'd be crazy ever to minimize that. But again, the important point, I think we both recognize there was progress, and it would have been great to have much, much more progress. But you guys definitely made progress. And as I say, I just find it unfortunate. Didn't get the credit you deserved. So, and yeah, we are where we are. I always say that, if we had the exact same economy in 223, 224, and Donald Trump was in the White House, damn well he would be saying greatest economy ever. Every Republican in the House and Senate would be repeating it, and you'd hear nothing but that from Fox News. So I know you guys aren't Donald Trump, and probably a good thing, but So let me just ask one last question. I'll let you get out of here. What's your biggest fear about the economy, let's say in the next 2-3 years?
Oh, man. I think isolationism is a huge problem. I think you and I both think about the economy very broadly. So, yes, consumers, I think that the tariff agenda is going to be really bad for prices, and people already have a lot of problems with that. But isolating ourselves from the international community, that's geopolitically, I think, highly risky. You see the clown show that's going on, with folks in defense and intelligence. So that's really worrisome. I think I would put it down to the following, to be a bit more concise maybe, is that there were a bunch of people who voted for the Trump administration, non-MAGA voters, who believed, for better or worse, that they would help them, that they would make their lives better, that they would improve their living standards. And, you could argue they should have known better, but, they threw the dice. And they're the very people who are going to get hurt most by what these folks are doing. I mean, Bidenomics really was about trying to make sure that people who are helping to bake the pie got a fair slice, and to help people who are vulnerable, to help people for whom government, is a very important backstop in their lives in lots of ways, economically, safety, and so on, education, poverty, realizing their potential. All of those things are already getting shafted under this administration, whether it's home ownership, whether it's labor protections, whether it's the ability to form and join a union, start a business. So I think the thing I worry most about is in many cases the very group of people that I worried most about when we were in power and we're trying to help. They're in power and they're trying to hurt. And that's the problem.
Yep, I have to agree with you at that. All right, well, thanks a lot for coming on the show with me, and I enjoyed it, and
Me too.
obviously we'll talk again.
And thanks again for your help over those years, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. There are a couple terms in that segment that I used that I realized might not be entirely clear to everyone. So let me just say a little bit more about each of them. One was industrial policy. And industrial policy is the idea of trying to promote specific industries. Sometimes that's explicit. Sometimes it's just the nature of the policy. It has that effect. So explicit industrial policy is exactly what the Biden administration was doing when it was trying to promote the advanced semiconductor industry with the CHIPS Act, and also promoting clean energy with the Inflation Reduction Act. They were quite explicit that they're trying to promote our semiconductor industry. They're trying to promote our electric vehicles, clean energy of different types, battery storage, very explicit goals of the policy goals. Less explicit, when we, post-World War II, we built up our military industry. We developed defense bombers, fighters. That was technology that was transferred to the civilian sector. So we had Boeing and other manufacturers, aircraft manufacturers, very successful worldwide leaders. That was an implicit industrial policy. That wasn't a stated goal, but everyone recognized that if you develop technology for fighter planes, for bombers, that will also be useful for civilian planes. And much of our technology, our industrial policy takes that form of implicit policy. Other countries have had much more extensive explicit policy. China certainly does. Years past, Korea, Japan, they've made decisions to promote certain industries. So that's what industrial policy is. The other one was that I mentioned the carried interest tax deduction. So Jared and I were talking about provisions in the tax code that help the financial sector that oftentimes make no particular economic sense, but they do promote the size of the financial sector. So I mentioned the carried interest tax deduction. This is something that primarily benefits partners in hedge funds and private equity funds. And what it does is it allows them to get paid shares of the earnings of the company. So just like a car salesperson might get a commission, they get 10% of the car price, or a realtor gets 3% of the house price. So they get paid on commission. That's treated as normal wages. So if a realtor gets $30,000 a year from commission on the homes they sell, that's normal wages. It's taxed as normal income, just like if you or I got a salary of $50,000 a year or whatever it might be, it's taxed as normal income. But what they do with private equity partners and hedge fund partners and a few others that fall into this boat, they have the carried interest tax deduction where they can say they get 20% of the profits of the funds they manage. And rather than being taxed as normal income, normal wages, it's taxed as capital gains. So these are mostly very high income people. They'd be in the 35% bracket. That's where we are now. They would pay 35% of whatever they got, and this could often be millions, so it's a lot of money. They'd pay 35% of that in taxes ordinarily, but instead it's taxed at the capital gains tax rate, which is just 20%. You have a lot of people, very middle-income people, school teacher might earn over $100,000 a year, firefighter, they're taxed at 25% of their wages. And here you have partners in hedge funds, private equity funds, they could be earning sometimes even tens of millions of dollars a year, and they're taxed at just the 20% capital gains rate. And that's because of this carried interest tax deduction, which again, it makes zero sense from any economic standpoint, but these are very powerful people. They make big campaign contributions, and they've been able to keep it in the law for decades. So that's the story with those terms. Sorry to use ones that may not be familiar to everyone, but that happens sometimes when we get two economists talking.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.